At noon, the sun disappeared and no one could agree on whether it was a cloud or a punishment. The sky above Turkana turned the color of a bruise as something moved over it, a fabric rippling and alive. People pointed with hands still dusted from shells of maize. Goats, usually stubborn, stood still, their ears twitching as if listening to a story they disliked. The first locusts announced themselves not by sight, but by sound. A dry static, 1,000 paper fans opening and closing at once. Then they arrived with the confidence of weather. Akin stood in her field and watched leaves turn to lace. Minutes earlier they'd been green and ordinary, sleeping through a hot season in a rough corner of Kenya where every stalk is in negotiation with fate. Now the green shredded under mandibles, moving like little sewing machines. Heckening reached for a branch, thinking, absurdly, that she could cover the plants with her body as a mother does with a child. One landed on her forearm, feet hooked and precise, eyes as blank as a coin. She flicked it, and it returned. The swarm came low, the air thick with soft bodies catching light in flashes of pink immature adults, not yet turned the full burnished yellow of breeding certainty. Behind and above them, the bigger mass wheeled. It moved not like birds, with minds in each breast, but like a single intention. The children ran in it as if in snow, laughing first, then crying because snow does not bite. Men banged pots, and women waved shirts on sticks. Smoke from small fires smudged the air to a deeper brown. The locusts. Ate under the smoke. They landed on roofs, walls, faces, and the land drew a breath it could not catch. The day had begun like any, the pitted jerrycan at the borehole. The gossip about rains that were a month late, or a year late depending on what you counted. A radio set on a ledge in the shade had crackled over breakfast with a warning in Kiswahili that seemed melodramatic at the time. A swarm biggest in living memory crossing the border from Somalia and Ethiopia, driven by winds and hunger and a biology older than the idea of borders. 40 to 80 million insects fit inside a square kilometer, the voice said, and a swarm can travel 150 kilometers in a day. The number was like a parable. The body only understands what it can touch. Now the numbers made themselves flesh and wing. In a small office at the county headquarters beneath a map with pins stuck in it like ticks a man with an FAO logo on his collar. Bent over a screen that showed a satellite image of the desert between Yemen and Oman. A place called the Empty Quarter for a reason. To cyclones Mekunu and Luban, 2018 had poured improbable rain into that emptiness, turned sand to shallow lakes, and brushed to a betrayal of green. Locusts, usually solitary there, had found one another in dense patches, brushed legs along Botus, kindled serotonin, and changed not individually but as a population into something else. Their muscles grew, their behavior altered, their colors flashed warnings and promises. They bred, then their children bred. And by the time civil war and terrain allowed anyone to notice, there had been 3 generations on unvisited ground. Then a wind came out of the north with the leisure to carry them. The entomologist, running a finger along isobars on a printed forecast, knew what the villagers did not, that this was not a singular event, a freak blizzard of insects. This was a machine. In November, the swarms had crossed the Gulf of Aden into the Horn, finding coastal Eritrea, Somalia, and eastern Ethiopia fat, with rain from an Indian Ocean warmed and tilted into a positive pasture within weeks, had become a breeding blanket. Now, in January, the great moving cities of insects were breaking on northern Kenya, climbing over hills, pausing to feast on a valley's acacia, laying eggs in sandy edges of riverbeds where any recent moisture remained. Night fell. The locusts became stupid with darkness and latched handsomely onto branches. You could hear the world thinking again under their small clicking. In the windless hours before dawn, Atin's sun shone his phone's light across the fields, torn rows. The lamp picked out a brown nymph with a hint of black banding wingless. Marching forward, the swarm does not arrive in only one form. On the North Road, a convoy of vehicles moved out pickup trucks, carrying men in pale coveralls, and a large black tank implying chemistry. Behind them, at odd intervals, you could hear the thumping of a small plane that had been contracted in a hurry, a crop duster with its wings patched with old repairs, now fitted with nozzles for ultra-low volume spraying. Pilots were being called in from where locusts were a memory. Labels on drums were being peeled back in dusty storerooms. Someone was counting masks. In Garo, a Somali herder named Fazil woke to quiet and walked to the ridgeline above his grazing. He liked the early when light is a theory. He looked over a horizon moving. His camels, usually composed, backed away from nothing like brave men from a rumor. He smelled the faint nutty breath of insects, and then he saw the army of hoppers at his feet, wingless but marching with conviction, an advancing carpet. He could not call anyone in his own country with the machines to see this as geography, not a story. The men with those machines were on the far side of a front line. He did what he could do. He clapped until his hands ached, and the sound knocked nothing from the carpet. Beamed morning. The second wave unfurled. The first had eaten and moved on. The second came younger and hungrier. At a local school, a teacher tried to make it a lesson the mathematics of multiplication, the way one female lays hundreds of eggs in rough trenches, the way a moist month becomes 100 days later a moving hunger. The children nodded and then stood from their benches and went outside to help their parents. Because education here has always been porous, walls are for shade, and classes dismissed by weather. By evening, a trail of emptiness traced the swarm mess. Pathfields, with leaves that had meant porridge, turned to bare stalks, pasture bitten to the root. Mango trees stripped so clean they might have been carved. On the highway, a bus drove through a storm of soft pellets and stopped as the grill filled and the engine coughed. People came out and posed for pictures, their bodies outlined in insects like saints outlined by gold leaf. Because humans will make a moment of spectacle and humor out of most things before they admit they are afraid. In a hangar in Addis Ababa, a mechanic tightened a hose clamp on an air tractor and told the pilot where to look for the shifting glinta. Pink dimness that marks a roosted dawn. In a lab in Nairobi, someone lifted a vial of green spores, Metahysium acridum, a fungus that only eats locusts and their relatives, and does its eating slowly, days, instead of hours. In the map room, by the pinholed wall, the entomologist smelled the wind and read the reports. Hatching in Wajir, bands forming in Tagdir, first adults in Karamoya. And Kenya had not seen this since the 1950s. He wrote in his notebook, "Second generation imminent." He opened his mouth to explain to a man in a suit, who would face a camera later, that if you wanted to stop it, you had to find the hoppers. Before they found wings, you had to put poison or fungus in the right place before sunrise. In a Ching's field, piles of locust bodies gathered against fence lines, like drifts of dried leaves. The chicken ate until it had to sit down and pant. The sky cleared until it didn't. On the third day, a darker line appeared on the horizon and came closer as a moving cavalcade. 6 kilometers long, 1 kilometer deep, densest at the center, thinning at the edges. An ecosystem traveling under power of heat and wind. Men put scarves over their noses. Achin tightened the knot on her baby and shifted the hoe on her shoulder. She and the baby and the hoe stood in front of the swarm as if it would respect the idea of a line. Then the first mouth found the first new leaf that it dared to open. Far upwind, near the dry river where the cattle drink, the ground ticked like rain as it opened to receive fresh eggs. The sound deepened, and the swarm bent toward the fields with a coherence that did not belong to any of the individual insects. On the phone in the county office, the pilot's voice came calm and clipped. Coordinates and fuel, estimates and guesses. The entomologist looked at the pins, at the wind, at the gaps in the fuel chain, at the border that cut through a flight path and meant paperwork. He dialed in an impossible number. The operator in Hargeisa told him to hold. The sun slid behind the back of the first dense front, and it was as if night had arrived. Early birds wheeled crazed and silent, and something the size of a city with a mind older than maps rubbed its belly against the land and prepared to eat again. They went for the greenest first, because that's what hunger does. Sorghum tassels vanished as if on teff, crumpled to stubble. In a line of cassava, the leaves turned from beefy handprints to veined ghosts, while their owners stood at the edge, held their foreheads in their palms, and tried to do the math on a season now gone. A body can drink tea instead of eat, but only for so long. The swarm laid down a rain of droppings that freckled the ground and made the skin itch. The static hum hooked itself to the inside of ears, so that even when you stepped into a house with walls, you could hear it. At 3 in the morning, the planes rose. The pilot, a woman who had flown crop in the Free State, measured the dark in her map with the same precision. She followed roads for bearings, counted radio towers, then flew by smell vegetation, thick on the air in places where the swarms anchored to roost, the heat rising under wings as they stirred at her engine's sound. When dawn peeled night away, she saw her target. Acacia crowns sagging under locust weight, thorn to thorn roped by boadies. She dropped to 20 meters and opened the nozzles. A fog threaded between leaves. She knew her mixture haze of malathion in ultra-low volume, a film that would gloss the insect cuticle and break the neat internal chemistry that makes flight and hunger possible. A kilometer away, another plane dusted with a slower weapon. The green spores that take days to germinate on a locust and chew it from within. It was mercy and cruelty braided. The job required both. On the ground, crews set up. Men hold handheld sprayers on their backs and waded into the hopper band's rivers of nymphs. Moving in a cord tight on the ground, each a single shade of brown with a black edge, marching because they did not yet know how to fly. You could stop them here, the manuals said, like pouring gravel into a stream to divert it. The men sprayed the edges first. 10 Englid in walked ahead of the moving front, so the first rows would take mortal doses. A boy with a plastic bag, the older brother of someone's future, tried to scoop and twist the bag into a balloon of insects and laughed as they spilled out from seams he had on tea. Tied tight enough, his grandmother shouted at him to come inside. Not from superstition, but because the chemicals on the wind were not a story. A WhatsApp group called Locust Watched blew up with coordinates and videos. A swarm shading Izilo. A band on the move near Berena. A wall of wing buzzing out of the horde. In Yemen, where gunfire often stands in for dialogue, the breeding continued, unobserved and undisturbed. In the empty quarter, the green after rainfall went gray as it was chewed back to sand, and then the last of the solitarious locusts crowded enough to learn the new behavior again. The Indian Ocean dipole had tipped warm water west twice in 2 years, and the atmosphere had answered with unusual rain. Old hands in the horn looked up and read the movement of the season and knew the lesson before the FAO released its bulletins. You will not make it to June without a second generation. In Capota, a pastor prayed over an acre. His voice even, the same as when a daughter is born, or when a war ends. He asked for the wind to shift east. The wind shifted north. Locusts flew on it the way laughter travels in a crowd, renowned and unstoppable. In a pasture outside Jagaga, a boy touched the ground and it moved under his hand. He leaped away, then back, his body seeking the thrill. His father, seeing the boy inside the phenomenon, remembered his own childhood in a swarm in 1986 that had also arrived like a parade. And then he remembered the dinner they had gone without, the goats that had skittered thin bones over rocks in the dry behind the school. And he pulled the boy away, not because children should not play, but because there are events that are not to be learned on bare skin. The phones at the county offices rang hollow with repetition. They are eating everything. The voice on the other end tried to give instruction that felt small. Light fires under the trees. At night, they stay up. At dawn, call us with the coordinates of their roost. The words moved at phone speed. The swarms moved at wind speed. The pilot took another pass and watched the edge of the swarm respond, thinning, curling inward. Bodies falling out of the air like leaves in a season that does not exist here. And yet, the math would not be denied. 1 square kilometer, enough to fit a town's worth of lives, holds up to 80 million locusts. They eat as much as 35,000 people in a day. In the days when the swarms numbered in the hundreds, and then the thousands, the figures begin to lose their relation to any scale. People whose currency is goats and sacks of maize tried to convert millions of insects into the absence of a meal, and found their minds refusing the exchange rate. The FAO's Desert Locust Information Officers sent out situation updates that turned verbs into warnings. Widespread breeding is underway. Hopper bands are forming. New swarms expected to form in February-March. The entomologist wrote into his notebook that the disease culling in natural systems would lag the breeding by months. This was not comfort. On the Nairobi-Mombasa road, a trucker wrenched the wheel as the swarm slapped into his windshield, turned wipers on, and smeared. He rolled down his window and stuck his head out into the clattering air. squinting into a movement that looked like static on an old TV. The avs chattered, and the truck straightened, and a goat in the ditch took the force of the corner he'd nearly not made. He pulled to the side and stood shaking, hair and beard peppered with wings. His body in that afterstate particular too near misses, where the world's beauty hurts. Then came the first rain of the new season, the termite-smelling downpour in March that puts green back on shoulders of hills. It washed the locust spatter from roofs. It made the swarms heavy so the birds could hunt them on the ground. It also brought eggs alive, in sandy soil where the females had curved their bodies and pressed Hutheka into pockets weeks before. The moisture bled down and woke what had been small, pearly pods from their waiting. The earth split in 1,000 pinpricks, and loosed 1,000,000 hoppers, then 1,000,000 more. They rose like a thought, and formed lines like veins. Echin put her thumb in the ground and came away with a paste that smelled like growth and threat. She called the number on the poster at the Chief S office and tried to articulate in a language not hers that the ground was moving. The man at the other end asked for coordinates she did not have. She tried a landmark. Dil Baobab, the dip in the road where the lorry always makes a noise. The ridgeline that looks like a sleeping man. The words found the ear of a local scout, a man on a motorbike with a GPS, and a hand pump and a knowledge of his place that allows him to be on time without a clock. He kicked the bike and a rooster crowed into the locust's noise and was swallowed. By April, reports put locusts into Uganda, into South Sudan, into the northern lowlands of Tanzania. In Iran, along the Persian Gulf, green strips along irrigation canals took a sudden brown cast as roving bands found them, moved on, then returned by some mindless arithmetic that said, if we ate here once, we can eat here again. In Pakistan, in Baluchistan, and Sindh, farmers watched a second pest line up against their wheat and cotton in a year when nothing had gone as expected. A map began to look like a heat image, glowing where hunger went most efficiently. In May, a second surprise arrived. The world closed its airports. Pilots were told to go home and then called to go back. Shipments of pesticide coming through Mombasa port were delayed behind medical supplies. COVID turned meetings into messages with lag on them, and the lag was a kind of locust. Invisible, contagious, eating seconds and minutes from days that needed all their hours. Locust control units, already threadbare, learned to keep distance from one another while swarms taught them about crowding. Instructions were shouted across open air, masks clogged with the dust of 1,000 wings. The work did not stop. The swarms did not pause to respect the crisis humans called theirs. In June, the light at 6 in the morning had a sharpness that made everything look new. In the swelter of an Ethiopian dawn, the entomologist pointed to a moving yellow in the air adults. Now mature, their pink turned saffron, their bodies organized around breeding for a third time. He ran through the same math he had been running for months. The way you run your fingers over a scar. He raised binoculars and watched the swarm lean toward a field stitched to the horizon with barley. He put the glass down, wiped sweat with the back of a hand, and whispered to no one, they're going to lay again. The third generation in a season when one used to be the norm. The ground shivered as their bodies snifed into it. Somewhere, a woman's last, uncut acre picked up a shadow. The pilot in her bunk turned on her side to save one ear from the generator and set her alarm for 3:30. Because the swarms would roost tonight and tomorrow, someone needed to be at the edge of the village with a line of spray. By July, the ground was too hot to touch at noon, and everything that could move did so at dawn and dusk. The hopper bands advanced like braided rivers, eddies where stones lay under the dust, currents where a fence funneled them. A Ching stood barefoot in her field at sunrise, and listened for a moment with a quiet that belonged to church, then took her hoe and began to draw trenches. Small breaks that might slow the crawling front for a minute, enough for the men with the sprayers to arrive. She had slept 3 hours. Broken. In the night she had dreamed of teeth working in concert, then of a blizzard. She woke convinced of cold and lay sweating. The pilot stood on the wing of the air tractor and watched a man pour concentrate into the tank through a sock to catch debris. We're low on malathion, he said, as if mentioning that sugar was out at the store. Green muscle is coming, but takes time in this heat. The choice then hung in the air. Kill quickly with organophosphates and accept their indiscriminate shadow, or kill slowly with fungus and accept its patience. The entomologist reached for the same balance he had been reaching for since December. Save crops today so children can eat tonight. Save ecosystems over months so they will not betray you next year. He signed the manifest. The pilot climbed into a seat and became the kind of person who acts. Across in Pakistan, in Thoraparkas, pale distances, a man named Asif drove a truck with a fogger on the back through the edge of his village and found that the locusts were a fact even before he turned the nozzle. They had arrived with the dusk and covered the thatch. His wife stood in the doorway with her headscarf pulled over her face against the swarm, and the children stood behind her, breathing through cloth the way their cousins in the city did against a different threat. The government had declared an emergency first in Dekasanda. Now the old planes took to the sky again in Sindh. Along the border with Rajasthan, Indian officials watched the wind, then watched the map, then watched the aqua. Sky eyes burning and waited to call out the squads with piped foggers to the fields of Berat. Their commands, wrapped in the strangeness of a new plague, arriving at the same time as an old one returned in a new form. In Odis, permits went missing into bureaucratic long grass. In Hargeisa, a volunteer broke a tooth on a pebble in his rice and decided not to mention it because the list of damaged small things was so long. In Nairobi, containers of pesticide cleared customs at the pace of an apology. In Rome, in a room with flags, the FAO's locust group stared at the daily updates, their faces folded by data and worry, and pushed out more money and more maps, pinged embassies for access to airstrips with gravel you could land on, and called in favors with air forces and contractors who had dusted cotton and wheat 3 continents away. The work went on in a choreography of small mercies. Scouts on motorbikes wore out, tires on thorn. They learned the way the locusts prefer to lay in sand with an easterly slope, the way a flooded wadi holds a green that demands to be eaten. They stopped at tea places and learned more in 5 minutes of cups and casual talk than in hours, staring at a screen. They sent pins with typos, 2 wide eyes and a hanger. In the air, the pilot raked a thin ribbon of poison across a polygon scribbled on a map made in haste yesterday, because the swarm had moved 25 kilometers since then, and at that speed your yesterday map is wrong. Pastoralists walked farther for fodder. Cows bellowed thin. Milk came watery. In Karamoya, a girl's growth faltered in a body otherwise laughing and inventive. Maize meal, already expensive, became a little more so. People further south snorted at the idea that locusts could end up on their plates. Then a south wind blew 3 days in a row, and a thin-winged line sketched itself above Thika Road, and Nairobi's drivers took out phones and turned traffic into a documentary. The city learned the sound, and then learned to forget it again because cities are good at making forgetting into a skill. In a clinic near East, a nurse treated a man who had rinsed his face in a canal below a field the pilot had just treated. The label on the drum had said not to do that in 3 languages he could not read. He lay on a cot and kept saying he was sorry for getting sick. The nurse turned his face toward the wall and adjusted a cannula and thought about all the other instructions she taught. Boil water, sleep under a net. Slower fevers mean worse things. Now this, too. Outside, a woman carried a child. The child's hair was light in streaks not earned by the sun. The child stared cheerfully at the locusts on any surface, as if they were pets because he had not yet learned what food is. The weight of failure sat in irregular heaps, a field eaten to dirt. A plane grounded by a part stuck at a border, a day lost to fog. A hidden roost discovered after daybreak when the locusts had already risen and gone, not along a straight line but in a breathless loop around a mountain range. A rumor that a shipment had leaked and a shopkeeper had sold pesticide cut with diesel because the label was impressive, and the money immediate. And the shape of success took forms to humble the publisher scout leading a pilot to a valley of hoppers before wings. A line of booms sprayed at precisely the hour when the band turned along the ditch wall. A sunrise where you could hear birds again, not because there were no locusts, but because there were fewer. The entomologist reminded anyone who listened that they were not fighting a mind, but a set of rules. Warmth, moisture, crowding trigger, reproduction when the body can, flight along wind, descent. To green, he stood under a sky that brimmed with a long, thin line of locusts, and thought about serotonin, a molecule inside a small nervous system, and how chaos, on the scale of a region, is written in a script as intimate as touch. In November, the Indian Ocean picked up another heat pulse, and a compact cyclone put its shoulder into Somalia's north. Gotti arrived as a surprise. Fiercest storm on record there, dumping water into canyons and flats. The week after, the scout stood on a black rock and looked down into a piece of desert gone neon. "It will breed again here," he said to no one, because the man had learned that saying it aloud did not change the weather or the budget. On Christmas Eve, the pilot flew her last light legal pass 11 minutes after sunset and put the plane down in a dusk that felt religious. The runway was a strip of dirt and rumor. The mechanic walked out with a headlamp and knocked sand out of a filter onto his own shoes. The entomologist scribbled numbers. The county officer filled in a form for a donor who had asked for outcomes. The runner poured water over his face and wiped it away with both hands. Aching set a plate of ugali and a thin sauce in front of her children, bit her own share in half, and put the other half back on the plate without anyone noticing, because mothers can make it look like that the amount they wanted. In the dark, the roosts lifted their dry chorus. The new year would arrive to a sky not yet empty. By the first weeks of the new year, the scale of the fight had finally matched the scale of the enemy. Yellow planes lined up at smaller airstrips, where goats had been the most consistent traffic. Pilots slept on mattresses in cargo containers, wore bandanas around their necks, and heavy sunglasses that left pale rectangles at their eyes. A government helicopter out of Wajir lifted at dawn with a tank full of biopesticide and came home with its skid greased from locusts crushed in takeoff. A Port Sudan warehouse that had been a waiting room for customs was now a pipeline. Drums and drums out, sometimes directly onto planes, because time is the only currency that matters when you change a sentence that begins with wide-scale breeding is underway. The FAO's bulletins began to sound like relief with a footnote. Control operations treated X hectares. This week, the number X mattered, because it meant field saved. Pasture not lost, but also because it signaled something psychological. Mastery had at least begun to converse with the swarm. Mobile ground teams in Somaliland, in Ethiopia's Afar, in Kenya's moved like a league you only join when dust is in your nose all day and wings spatter the windscreen at night. They trained on the fly and later through a formal curriculum the eye it takes to read a hillside. For the glint that is not sunlight but wing over the western Indian Ocean, the monsoon wafted in a particular way, and you could feel in your bones that the winds would not line up for a fourth generation that would ride south into the breadbasket. In a Rome office, half a world away, a forecaster drew arrows with more confidence. In Giga, a scout sent a video of a band already mottled with fungus, little green handle of death shaping itself inside a locust's chest. Green muscle taking, he wrote. Voice proud, because patience had an aesthetic, too, and he had learned to love the slow certainty of rot. In the same time, the opposite sort of report came in from Yemen Linza, text that slowed to a crawl, then stopped. Breeding continues along coast. No control. The war that had hidden the first generations still sheltered this one. It meant that whatever progress you made, east and south, the headwaters of the plague were always refilling. The entomologist felt a kind of vertigo reading it, as if he were looking at a tap turned on that he could not reach with his hands or mind. The words locusts, corridor, and access constraints repeated in memos like an incantation that did not summon what was needed. In Gujarat and Rajasthan, the Indian Locust Warring Organization had been resuscitated out of archives. Jeeps with speaker horns stalked roads, and teams overnighted in Kathis with folk songs bleeding under doors while they plodded down wind cuts through desert. They had not seen density like this in decades. Night sweeps with torchlight and spray wands became ceremonies. Heat, smell of chemical, the whispering rain of insects, grounding and going quiet forever in piles that made faint heat of their own. In Balochistan, Pakistani teams did much the same, and for a rare moment, the maps and radios spoke across borders without comment. Because wind does not respect men's drawings, and hunger is a kind of diplomacy. On the Somali steppe, a new profession put on reflective vests. Community locust scouts. They were young men on motorbikes with handheld GPS and battery banks. They had teachers retired spraymen from the last cycle, FAO agronomists with patience, pilots with laconic advice. They learned to upload geotag photos, upload in bursts, when they got a signal on a ridge, then find again the line in the sand that they had marked, where eggs lay invisible. to come back the day after a rain and scratch the ground with a stick and see if white capsules came up like cloves. They learned that their daily art could put a plane above the right tree at the right minute. It made the day bearable. COVID continued to tug at the edges of everything. A crew went down with fever. A team quarantined. A shipment was held in a port behind a new protocol. Masks trapped the heat of your breath as you walked into an oven of thorn. In the air, the pilot flew with a cloth over her headset, until she forgot that a headset once felt different. Mechanics boiled coffee and moved parts between shade and sun to read them differently. Thirst became a second oxygen. In April, the big question came like weather on a spread-out table. Will the long rains make everything worse again? The forecast argued with itself. In the south, the rain would be normal. In the north, less. In the east, odd. The men and women with authority looked at one another in boxes on screens and decided on more of everything they could throw. More planes, more fuel, more scout trainings, more drums, more Mederaceum, more community messaging that read like folk medicine but was not a spray. At dawn, do not sleep under a roost. Do not pump water out of a canal at a place where a plane's shadow has just passed. Watching the front lines, Aching saw something she had not seen in months. A morning where the locusts did not arrive. She carried a pot to her neighbor, stood in the doorway, and handed over a share she could not spare. A ceremony she had been raised inside and would be buried inside because there are economies older than cash. They will come tomorrow, the neighbor cautioned. Maybe, Aching said, and the space that opened between their words was tiny. Up in the air, the pilot burned a curved line along the upwind edge of a locust wall and watched the wall flinch. In the hangar, the entomologists looked at a scatter of dots that were not just dots anymore but a trend. The densest areas were thinning. The new generations in Kenya were fewer. Ethiopia remained a knot. Somalia remained a wound you could not stitch. He had not slept a full night in months. He closed his eyes for a minute and saw wings. He opened them to the sound of a mechanic swearing cheerfully about a gasket that had given up under heat. He smiled for the first time all week. At dusk on an island of pasture in afar, a herder named Fatima brought her goats inside a ring of thorn and listened. The night had been an orchestra lately, every bush strummed by insects. Tonight she could hear stars, which is to say she could hear the spaces between sounds. She turned her face up and decided the same thing the entomologist had decided with his instruments. The crest of the wave had passed here. She did not say it aloud in case the wind was listening. She ran a hand over a goat, a narrow face, and felt the shape of her own hunger receding like a fever breaking. On the radio at the county office, the supervisor's voice came clipped. New swarm crossing from Somalia near El Wak. The wind lines had thickened into arrows. The pilot and the scout put fingers on the same map and landed on different spots a finger width apart. They both said they were right. The supervisor put his hand over the mouthpiece and closed his eyes and saw a line of acacia in a particular wadi that always held them. He moved his finger to a third spot. The others followed his finger because in this business, as in others, there is a moment when someone has to decide and then people need to move. Engines coughed awake. The first plane spun dust. The entomologist collected a vial of spores from the shade and put it in a pocket as if carrying luck. By the time the planes were on the wing, the swarm had pitched into a new direction southwest, skirting the edge of the treated polygon like a mine that gauges the edge of pain and stays just outside it. It moved not toward the desert, but toward a seam of farms that had, through all these months, somehow avoided the worst. Children were playing soccer in a field that would, by mid-morning tomorrow, if nothing intervened, be overhung by a black weather sky. The pilot hit push to talk and said a single word that meant change course. No. In the county office, the supervisor put the heel of his hand against his temple and held it there as if he could press inside the skull and squeeze out enough judgment. He lifted his hand and moved a red pin without comment. On the ground. On the ground. Acheen tied a cloth around her hair and stepped out into a twilight that sounded like nothing at all except hurried wings in the distance, getting louder. They caught the swarm at the lip of the last green. 2 planes came in line abreast, shadows rolling over the soft slope of militant sort, arcs of spray stitching a crosshatch into the air. The first pass broke. The edge locusts peeled away in sheets, like flakes off pastry. The second pass bit into the center, the mass hiving upon itself, pressed by force of chemical and air into a smaller shape. On the third pass, the roar of wings went up, an indignant, almost choral sound, and then it dimmed. On the ground, the spray teams went to work at the places where flight breaks and crawling begins. Along fence lines, in the lee of bushes, they walked in a line like beaters in a field, the nozzles whispering, the green bottles of biopesticide in the shade ready for where the line would hold. The scout ran from one end of the line to the other and put a hand out for a bottle without speaking. "Ten, run back." He stepped over a turtle, its shells smeared with living confetti, and carried the slow animal to a clean pool at the edge of the field, because a man will pause a war for a moment to save a thing that cannot save itself. He turned back and shouted coordinates over his shoulder, and the pilot, hearing them through static, adjusted a degree and a half. By noon, the swarm was no longer itself. It was patches and pulses. Children came out with sacks and made games of capturing them in hundreds. Old men stood with their arms folded and counted birds, returning to eat their proper share of the world. Hutching looked at the trees behind her house and saw that their leaves were still there, which did not mean safety, but felt like evidence. She went inside and stood with her hand on her pot and decided against cooking until the smell in the air changed. She stepped back out and closed her eyes and sniffed. It smelled like diesel, like soap, like a garden after a stranger has walked through it familiar, altered. She nodded. Across the region, stories like this were multiplied by thousands. In eastern Ethiopia's golden hour, a plane turned off its last nozzle, rose, circled a field that brimmed with the possibility of grain, and the pilot let her rocks tumble out of her chest one by one as she breathed and listened to the engine tick and cooling. In Somaliland, a team coiled hoses under a thorn tree and fell asleep on their backs, arms thrown wide, mouths open to the world that was not done with them yet. In Pakistan, a politician stood at a microphone and mispronounced metahysium, and everyone clapped anyway, because the point had been made. Someone was paying attention. By June, the FAO's charts dipped and did not rise again. Immature swarms declining. Control operations continue. Only low numbers remain, became the language. The places that had bred them to begin with, either dried to the hard truth of desert or were finally reached by teams that could scratch away the quiet eggs. In Yemen, even there, a corridor opened along a hard coast, and a team went in with pump sprayers and a helicopter. And when they came out, sunburned and freighted with the news, they laughed as if at a joke because the relief had made them silly with joy. The relief well of any plague is monotony. Long days of not seeing what you fear. Long nights of hearing what you fear only in your bones. By August, the monotony became a new truth. Pastures in Afar grew their old toughness back. The pale stitch of green in Isiolo held through to seed. In Turkana, a ching planted again. The field was still threadbare. Some of the seeds did not sprout. Some did. She weeded carefully around the ones that did as if the whole world depended on each plant, which in a way it did. The pilots departed one by one in planes sticky with the memory of petroleum and fungus, swung out over a land that was greener than the day they'd arrived, and lifted for home. The last morning the pilot walked the wing and touched it as if the aluminum had a spirit. She slid a hand over a dent she knew she'd caused on a two-foss taxi to a patch of shade, and chuckled. The mechanic hugged her with the awkwardness of a man who smells of solvent and respect. The entomologist shook her hand and looked at her for longer than Palat, and then looked away because he had learned to keep his eyes for insects. In offices with air a little too cool, men and women wrote. What went wrong? What went right? They called it after action and turned grief into bullet points. Climate stood up in every paragraph like a guest who arrived early. The positive Indian Ocean dipole had sent unusual rains. Warm seas had birthed storms where no storm should be. War had opened a door and bureaucracy had held it open. Surveillance had been late. Response had been smaller than the need until it wasn't. They wrote what could be done. Keep planes within quick reach. Train scouts before the next egg. Buy biopesticide and store it where hot nights wouldn't kill it. Pay the men and women who call in coordinates on motorbikes on time because a late salary is a small plague. Let borders soften for locusts and for those who chase them. In museums and classrooms, A short film played of a sky going black over a schoolyard, and kids running with hands in the air, not in fear, but in a feral joy. The narrator spoke gently about phase change, about serotonin and crowding, and how the solitary become gregarious, in a flash that changes how a body holds itself in the world. A teacher told her students that humans did that too, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. A year later, a man in the silo stopped walking because he could hear a sound under the cicadas that made the hair on his arms rise. He stood listening until he could say out loud and laugh, "No, not that. Just rain." A goat put a foot into the wet dirt and drew it out clean. Fatima's goats carried bellies they had not had last season. Ching-esque children went to school that had a shade and ate a cup of maize and beans at noon and called it githeri and made jokes about how there must be locusts in it, and listened to the huff of someone pretending to be a swarm and ran across the yard because you cannot live in a land where terror has flown without pointing at the sky and shouting once for pleasure. In the evenings, in the cool under a thin moon, those who had been closest to the buzzing told stories. They spoke of an old man in Marsabit who had eaten locusts fried with salt and chili crunchy, and called them noisy fish. They spoke of a pilot who could see a roost at dawn from 10 kilometers away and turn into it like a hawk. They spoke of a boy on a motorbike who had driven 100 kilometers on thorn, on a flat, just to deliver a pin that would bring a plane at dawn to the exact bush, and then had gone home and slept for a day and a half. They spoke of the day the swarm did not arrive and the silence felt heavy and holy. The entomologist went back to Rome in a suit he had not worn in a year and talked into microphones about the future. How the Indian Ocean would warm again, how cyclones would write new wetness into deserts, how locusts will always be waiting in their usual places, solitary and brown, quietly nibbling, ready to remember togetherness at the touch of a crowd. He showed a picture of a hopper band meeting a strip of fungus, and said the word prevention until it felt like song. The ocean at night takes heat and gives it back to the dawn. The land accepts rain and returns green. The locusts have tucked themselves back into their thin latitudes. The kids with plastic bags have put them away. In a corner of Turkana, Etching moves through her field with a basin and a machete, coiling maize leaves in her left hand, cutting, with her right laughing at a joke her oldest has made about the world ending, and then not. The air is sounded by birds again, and sometimes by airplanes, but rarely by that old dry thunder. She stands and looks up, the instinct hardwired now to scan the sky. A single grasshopper jerks away from her foot. Say, let's it go. If stories like this move you, subscribe for more true events that changed the world.